Well, good evening. I'm Don Carlton. I'm the Executive Director of the University's Stoff Briscoe Center for American History. On behalf of my colleagues at the Briscoe Center, as well as my colleagues at the LBJ Library, especially its director, Mark Updegrove, I welcome you to tonight's program. The Briscoe Center and the LBJ Library have forged a close partnership. In our program this evening, A White House View of 9/11 is another example of what has become a very special collaboration. It's included our joint sponsorship of a major exhibit about Walter Cronkite, as well as our current exhibit, News to History. And I want to thank the LBJ Library staff and Mark Updegrove for their tremendous support. Tonight we gather to reflect on the events of September 11, 2001. And to hear from senior members of the Bush administration about that day's events. Now, there are certain dates that are deeply etched in the American collective consciousness. Perhaps the two most notable examples in the 20th century are December the 7th, 1941, and November the 22nd, 1963. The events that occurred on those days were burned into the memory of all who experienced them. The shocking attack on Pearl Harbor, the tragedy of John F. Kennedy's assassination. Those moments are what Walter Cronkite once called, quote, tragic collective national experiences, unquote. They were entirely unexpected, shocking, and terrible attacks that were seemingly aimed at the very heart of an entire society. Those events have become part of our collective memory as a people. And in the new century came the bright morning of September 11, 2001. Although more than a decade has passed since the horrific events of that day unfolded, I'm sure that each and every one of you remembers vividly where you were and what you were doing when you first heard of the attack on the World Trade Center. The indelible images of the Twin Towers collapsing, the smoking rubble at the Pentagon, and the charred field in Pennsylvania have also been seared into our nation's collective memory. Tonight's program brings us a unique group of eyewitness accounts of that day, as seen from the President's inner circle. We'll have Karl Rove, Karen Hughes, and Clay Johnson, all senior members of the Bush administration, come up on stage for a panel discussion in the second part of our program. But first, we begin with a special presentation by photojournalist Eric Draper. Eric served as George W. Bush's chief photographer for the entire 8 years of the Bush presidency, and he was given the title of Special Assistant to the President, the first White House photographer to be named a commissioned officer to a United States president. Prior to joining the White House, Draper was with the Associated Press. He is currently a freelance political, corporate, and editorial photographer. I met Eric as a result of the Briscoe Center's program to collect and preserve the archives of American photojournalists. Eric agreed to designate the Briscoe Center here at the university as the permanent home for his personal photo archive. When I invited Eric to place his collection at the center, he asked if we would be interested in helping him publish a book of his White House photos. Well, that question was very easy to answer. I immediately said yes. I'm delighted that our discussion resulted in the book Front Row Seat, which was released this summer as part of the Briscoe Center series at the University of Texas Press. It's a wonderful book, beautifully designed and produced by the talented folks at the University of Texas Press. Eric's photos are also part of our exhibit here at the LBJ Library, News to History. Being the official White House photographer for any presidency is a distinction in and of itself, but to have that front row seat for a day like September 11 is a singular experience, one that Eric will now share with us. Please join me in welcoming Eric Draper.
Thank you, Don. You know, it's always special to come here to Austin, Texas, because for me, this is where it all began. This is where I made my personal pitch for the job, and also this is where I interviewed for the job with Chief of Staff Andy Card. And I'll never forget during that interview what Andy Card told me back in Austin. And this is in December of 2000 when it all started. He said that working at the White House was like trying to drink water through a fire hose at full throttle. And he was right. 9/11, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the Columbia shuttle disaster, funerals for 2 presidents and a pope, another close presidential election, the worst U.S. natural disaster in history, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. I traveled to nearly 70 countries with President Bush, 49 states. Sorry, Vermont. I made nearly 1 million pictures during my 8 years as the chief White House photographer. And for all you techies out there, the storage for the digital database came in around 50 terabytes of information. And as the chief White House photographer, my goal was to photograph everything that was on the president's schedule. But also, even beyond that, I tried to capture the humanity of the presidency. And President Bush gave me that opportunity to photograph him not only as commander-in-chief, but as a father, as a husband, as a dog owner, and as a Texan. And then there are the surprise moments, which I relish as a photojournalist, capturing those moments that you just can't plan for. I call this photo timing is everything. And then there are moments that I could plan for, like the first entry into the Oval Office in January 20th, 2001, the first signature as president. Now, let me give you some context here. This is on day 1, after all of the ceremonies, the swearing-in ceremony, the parade, the first entry into the Oval Office, and all the inaugural balls that happened that night. I was able to take the last and final ride to the final ball with the President and Mrs. Bush, and I captured this image here, and it's a human moment. And what I love about it is this is a great illustration of the President's personality. You know, he's out there, he's an extrovert, he's just out there, and Mrs. Bush is more reserved. The first landing of Marine One on the South Lawn. And I could prepare for a lot of things, but nothing could prepare me for September 11th, 2001. I was with the President at the elementary school in Sarasota, Florida that morning. And the first image here shows the President after he left the classroom, and this is after the famous whisper in the President's ear when Andy Card said that America is under attack. And I didn't know exactly what was happening until I walked into that room and saw the television screen and saw the live images of the burning towers. And I was just kind of frozen in shock, like a lot of people were in that room. But the President, he never looked up at the TV, because I was waiting for that moment that he acknowledged what was happening, because that was one way of connecting him with what was happening in New York. So what he did was he picked up that notepad you see in his hand on the table, and he started collecting his thoughts, writing his first thoughts, preparing for his first statement to the nation and to the world in response to the attacks. And something that's really fascinating, that piece of paper is actually on display in the Bush Library. And something interesting also, the timing of all these images is pretty critical. You can see the time here on the clock. This is about almost 9:18. And inside the classroom, the President and his staff basically everyone was gathering information about what was happening in New York. Everyone had pagers and cell phones. This is before the smartphone and the BlackBerry age. And again, this is the President talking on the phone, and I was still waiting for that moment until he actually stopped to see what was happening on TV. But it wasn't until around 9:25, and Dan Bartlett is pointing in that picture, and he's alerting everyone in the room because they were replaying the video of the second tower hitting, the second plane hitting the second tower. And for the first time, President Bush sees that image that's burned into everyone's memory, Flight 75 hitting the South Tower. And at this stage, everything was focused on New York, and no one knew the scope of what was to come. The president walks into the room filled with press and filled with school children, and he started his statement with a moment of silence. Aboard Air Force One, and this is around 10 o'clock, the vice president had been evacuated to a secure location from the West Wing. Flight 77 has crashed into the Pentagon. Flight 93 has been hijacked. The entire US airspace has been shut down. And the discussion going on here on the plane here, this is Andy Card and the president. And the president really wanted to return to Washington. And Andy Card is basically telling the president, no, it couldn't happen. And he was not happy. And this is a group effort here telling the president it just wasn't safe to return to Washington. And this is around the time that we started hearing a lot of false reports flying around the plane. We heard that a car bomb exploded in front of the State Department, false. We heard that a fast-moving object was headed towards the president's ranch, it was false. And then came the most surreal moment when the president himself came out of the cabin and he said, I just heard that Angel is the next target, and Angel is the code name for Air Force One. So the president's on the phone and huddled in the corner there. That's Andy Card with Secret Service agent Eddie Marenzo on the left, Lieutenant Colonel Tom Gould, who was a military aide, and Mark Rosenker was the director of the White House military office, determining where to take the president. I mean, I had no clue where we were headed. And around 10:20, Flight 93 has crashed. Around 10:40, the president watches the live images of the collapse of the Twin Towers. And this is definitely just a horrific moment, just because just knowing how many people were dying in the towers at the time, and it was just silence. And the president stood there for several minutes, didn't say a word. And by this time, we learned that we were headed to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. And Air Force One is the only place where you can actually watch yourself land live on TV. And that's what I experienced during that flight. As we approached Louisiana, and there was a TV in the conference room that was on, and they break in and they say, Air Force One spotted over Louisiana, and it's really just surreal to watch ourselves land. And on the ground, I thought my story would actually end at that moment, because the Humvee served as the president's limo, and he sped away and disappeared. The rest of the staff were huddled onto buses, and we luckily ended up following the president's route, and I ended up catching up with the president again, who had just started his very first full briefing on the situation. He's connected via teleconference with all of the agencies around the country and getting his first full briefing about the attacks. And we're on the ground in Louisiana for nearly 2 hours, and I can see the frustration building on the president's face, because he really wanted to return to Washington. He wanted to lead from the Oval Office. Our second stop was Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, where the president received more briefings behind those doors. That's a Secret Service agent guarding the door. Aboard Air Force One, that's the Air Force One crew in the conference room. And what made the day even more surreal, Air Force One was not equipped with satellite TV at the time. And so in order to receive reception, we had to fly over a major city. And so the news that everyone was getting aboard the plane would just fade in and fade out. It just made the day seem even more like a nightmare. The president on the phone with the vice president. And around this time, we finally learned that we're headed back to Washington, D.C. And for me personally, it was the first time that I had the opportunity to call my wife, who had just moved to D.C. 5 days prior to 9/11. So I knew she was at home, and I'll never forget, as she answered the phone, the first words I said were, "Honey, I'm going to be home a little late tonight." And I can hear her laughing through her tears. The President with Harriet Myers as we approached Washington. And this is around the time that we started noticing the F-16 fighter jets escorting the plane. They had been with us all day, apparently, and we didn't see them until we started to make the approach to Washington. So out of the left side of the plane, you can see the jets almost touching the wing of Air Force One. Out of the right side of the plane, you can still see the plume of smoke rising from the Pentagon. And the President returned to the White House, and he was able to have his first face-to-face meeting with the Vice President in the PIOC, which I didn't know existed before that day. That's the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. September 12th, the morning after, Condoleezza Rice watches the sun rise as the President makes his very first phone call of the day to British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Also on September 12th, the President visited the Pentagon to see the damage firsthand and to thank first responders. September 14th, the day of national prayer, that was a very long, emotional roller coaster of a day. It started out here at the National Cathedral, and this is the moment after the President delivered his remarks, and he returned to his chair, and his father reached over to touch his hand. Very tender moment. On our way to New York City, we left Washington. We're actually, this image here was taken aboard Marine One, and the President is looking out at the Pentagon as we flew over on our way to Andrews Air Force Base. And this is also the very first day the President started wearing the flag pin. At Ground Zero, the President was wading through the hundreds of firefighters there that were, felt like standing on a raw nerve, because you can feel the intensity of the emotion, you can feel the frustration, you can feel the fatigue, you can see the fatigue in their eyes, and you can feel that they were looking for the President for leadership. They were hugging the President, they were crying with the President, they were telling the President, "Go get him, George," and you can feel it building to this moment, the bullhorn moment, when the President stood atop the rubble and delivered the famous line that "We can hear you, the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear from all of us soon." Being at the White House for 8 years, I had the opportunity to witness so many stories come full circle. Well, the firefighter in the background that screamed, "I can't hear you," and prompted that famous historic moment, the President met him 4 years later. And I actually saw this guy in the crowd. He was at a political rally in Pennsylvania, and he's in the crowd screaming, "I can't hear you, I'm the guy, I'm the guy." And it took me a while for him to convince me, and it was him. His name was Rocco Chiricelli. And so I said, "I've got to get you backstage to meet the President." And so I was able to get him backstage. It was a very emotional meeting. Both men were crying and hugging, and the firefighter told the President, "Mr. President, my son's going to West Point. You've changed my life." And the President stopped him and he said, "No, you changed my life." After the moment at Ground Zero, the President visited for nearly 2 hours with the family of the victims of 9/11, and this is, again, just in a very intense situation here. The President walks into a room filled with nearly 400 people, all grieving, but all just holding out that there is hope that survivors will be found. It was, for me, the most difficult situation ever to photograph in. I was confronted a couple of times by some of the family because they didn't know what I was doing there, and so it was really hard to respect their privacy and to make pictures. And the President hugged and cried with each and every one of them. There were people walking around with handwritten notes saying, "Have you seen my father? Have you seen my mother?" there were children carrying photographs of their parents. And it was just the saddest situation ever to photograph, and it's really very intense. And during that meeting with the families, the president was given a badge. And this badge was worn by George Howard, a New York Port Authority officer who died on 9/11 wearing that badge. It was given to him by his mother, Arlene Howard. And during that moment that the president received the badge, Arlene Howard told the president, "Don't you forget my son." And the president said, "I'll never forget." And so I felt it was very important symbolically to have that badge photographed in the president's hand, because the president actually carried that badge during the weeks and the months that followed 9/11, and he would actually pull it out of his pocket and tell the story about George Howard to remind people what happened that day. So one day in the Oval Office, this is like late October, I asked the president if I could photograph it in his hand, and he said, "Of course," and he pulls it out of his pocket, and I make my picture. And that's my last slide. Thank you.
This is what they call the moment of transition. I was going to do a little tap dance, but Up to Grove vetoed it. While we're setting up, it's going to be my great pleasure to introduce our panelists for the remainder of tonight's program. Ambassador Karen Hughes has more than 30 years of public policy, communications, and political experience, and she is currently worldwide vice chair of Burson Marsteller. Hughes served as counselor to President George W. Bush in 2001 and 2002, as strategic advisor to the president on policy and communications. Clay Johnson was a senior member of President George W. Bush's administration for 8 years, and on September 11 was assistant to the president for presidential personnel. Clay Johnson served with Governor Bush in Austin as his appointments director and chief of staff, and he planned and directed the Bush-Cheney transition into office. Currently, Clay Johnson is president of the Texas State History Museum Foundation here in Austin. Karl Rove served as senior advisor to President George W. Bush from 2000 to 2007, and from 2004 to 2007, he served as deputy chief of staff. At the White House, he oversaw the offices of strategic initiatives, political affairs, public liaison, and intergovernmental affairs, and was deputy chief of staff for policy. Karl Rove writes a weekly op-ed for the Wall Street Journal. He's a contributor to Fox News, and he's the author of the book, Courage and Consequence, My Life as a Conservative in the Fight. Tonight's panel will be moderated by my good friend, LBJ Director Mark Updegrove. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Welcome. As Dr. Karl mentioned, we all have memories of 9/11. All of us in this room know where we were on 9/11, but your experiences are particularly significant given who you worked for at the time. Karl Rove, as you saw in those photographs that Eric just shared with us, was with the president throughout the course of that day. And Clay Johnson and Karen Hughes were in Washington, and we'll spend the balance of this evening hearing their stories of that day and their reflections. And Karl, we'll begin with you. You were with the president in Sarasota, Florida, at the Elmer E. Booker Elementary School in what was to be an address about education reform. It's ironic in some ways because George Bush expected and wanted to be the education president, and at the end of that day, he ended up being a war president. What is your recollection of the start of 9/11?
Well, first of all, I really enjoyed Eric's pictures until I realized that was me and I had hair and it wasn't gray. So, Don mentioned the bright day, and it was really, I remember that morning we got up early, the president went running, and it was a very bright and wonderful day. I mean, it was just picture perfect weather. And we went to the elementary school, Emma Booker Elementary School, and about at 8:48 my phone rang, and it was my assistant, Susan Ralston, who said a plane's flown into the World Trade Center. We don't know whether it's jet or prop, commercial or private. And the president was about 10, 15 feet away, shaking hands with administrators and teachers, and so I went over and told him. And he had a funny look on his face and said, "Get more details." About a couple minutes later, Condi called and had the same sketchy information. And he went into the classroom. He was a reading demonstration promoting No Child Left Behind, his signature education legislation. And I had to go scurry up a TV because there was not a TV that worked in the staff hold. Wherever the president travels, there's always a room nearby called the staff hold where they, a couple of days beforehand, they show up with big boxes and unpack. You saw the picture in Eric of a black telephone unit. I mean, you push O on that button and some guy under Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado answers, and a minute later you can be talking to anybody anywhere in the world. And they guard him until about 20 minutes after the president departs, and then they take him back. But that day, the staff hold had the phones, but they didn't have a television set. So I spent the opening moments of the War on Terror by stealing a television set from a nearby classroom. And I remember I had to plug it into the power unit, but I also had to plug it into the wall to get a signal, cable TV. And the first hole I plugged it into didn't work. The second one I plugged it into, it went pop. I'm lying on the ground doing this in a suit, and it goes pop, and it comes on, and the voices are saying, "What did we just see? What did we just see?" And that was the second plane flying into the World Trade Center. Andy Card, the chief of staff, determined that he needed to go tell the president. And Clay and I you were recently with Andy at another major Texas university whose name will go unmentioned, A&M. And I remember at the time, Andy walked over to the door, separating the staff hold from the classroom, and he hesitated. And this was a moment where, time is moving rather rapidly, and for Andy to go stand at the door, I mean, it was like eternity. I'm sure it was only a couple of seconds. But I never knew why until the three of us were together and heard Andy explain that he was trying to collect his thoughts so that he could walk in and tell the president what he needed to know in a way that the president would not feel compelled to ask a question. Because the president had 30 or 40 press with cameras and tape recorders and a room full of, fourth and fifth graders and educators and administrators, and this was not a moment where, there needed to be a discombobulation. So Andy went in and told the president, "A second plane has flown into the World Trade Center. America is under attack," and stepped back. The president had to make a decision what to do, and this reading demonstration was rolling to a close, so he decided rather than to jump up and run out of the room, he'd wait until it finished. So it was another 4 minutes or 5 minutes before he emerged into the room. And in the interim, the tension inside the staff hold had sort of grown. I mean, this is a first-rate group of people there. You saw some of them, Harriet Myers, then Major Tom Gould of the Air Force, Major Paul Montanus of the Marines, and senior staff of the president. But there was palpable tension and anxiety in the room because we're watching what the rest of America is watching. And I'll never forget it. Bush came into the room, and he was unnaturally calm and cold almost. And he said, "We're at war, get me the director of the FBI and the vice president." And there was a sense of steel in his voice that was unnaturally calming as well for us all. So we jumped on the phones and began to call. This is the moment at which the vice president is being grabbed by a couple of Secret Service agents and literally carried down the hallway in the West Wing to the secret entrance to the POC, the President's Emergency Operations Center underneath the South Lawn. And we can't get him, but we get Mueller, and we start talking to other people. The president, as you saw, was writing a statement. What you didn't see was that he wrote most of the statement sitting in a little chair made for kindergartners at a table made for fourth graders. Most of the adult furniture had been taken out of the room, and he's sitting there scribbling this statement, which gave him about a minute to give. And as he was getting to the end of scribbling out what he wanted to say, and he was talking with Dan Bartlett, Karen's deputy, and Ari Fleischer and me, Eddie Marenzel, who is the Secret Service guy with the incredibly bad ties, came over and said to the president, said, "Mr. President, we need to get you to the airport and airborne as quickly as possible." They were worried that this was, the president's whereabouts was known, and they were worried that this was an effort to decapitate the government, and that someone might fly an airplane into the Emma Booker Elementary School, or there might be a suicide bomber nearby. So the president made a statement. We went and we got in the limo, we got in the car. I normally didn't ride with the president in the limo, but that day sort of said and pointed to the stagecoach, which was then the code name for the limousine. And I got in with him, and we went off to the airport. Now, presidential motorcades generally go about 40, 45 miles an hour. We were going like bat out of hell at about 85 miles an hour. And during the course of the ride to the airport, the president got the phone call about the strike on the Pentagon. Now, I can only hear one side of the conversation, but when the opening words are, "Is Rumsfeld alive?" That was the first thing the president said in response to it. You know, that ain't good news. And I remember being so, when I heard that, I just had to look away from the president. And so I looked out the window of the car, and I realized that if I could roll down the window of a stagecoach, that about a foot away from the car, matching our speed, 80, 85 miles an hour, was a police car. And I realized suddenly that there was one on every side of the car, which is, I'd never seen it before and never saw it again. When we got to the airport later in the day, I said to Eddie Marenzel, I said, "Eddie, what was that all about?" And he said, "We were worried that a suicide bomber might near be by, a truck bomb or a car bomb, and so we wanted to improve the president's chances of survivability, give him an extra foot or two more for the blast to go off, so we surrounded the car with the hope that they'd block any suicide attack on the stagecoach." Which, sort of horrifying. Later on, I got to thinking, what the hell was I doing in that car with him? But
human shield.
Human shield. The decoys in Kosovo, remember?
Yeah. Karen and I was once the decoys in Kosovo when the president flew into an airport controlled by the Russians. We were in a little airplane, and they flew us in ahead of the president. The president was out there orbiting, and we're going in for the airport. And we said to the guy who's manning the radar console, "What the heck's going on?" He said, we're trying to see if we can draw any fire." Well, that was my day to draw fire. So. But we got to the airport, and there's a certain ceremony for any president when they get to mount up the steps Air Force One. I'm sure you've seen it on television. They have, there's a group of people at the bottom of the stairs who say goodbye to the president, local dignitaries, and then the president mounts the stairs and gets to the top of the stairs and turns around and waves to the crowd. Most of the time, many times there's no crowd, but they were always television cameras, so pretend there is a crowd. So wave to the crowd. The president goes onto the plane, and then a minute or two later, they allow the staff to get on the plane, and 10 or 15 minutes later, they rev up the engines and button the plane up, and it takes off. Well, I was standing at the bottom of the stairs. I remember Eddie Marenzel was standing with his foot on the lower step, and I was standing at the bottom of the stairs, and the president got about halfway, 2/3 of the way up, and Eddie turned to me. You could tell something went off in his earpiece, and he turned to me and said, "Go." And he didn't mean meander, he meant go. And so I started running up the stairs, and colleagues started running up behind. And I got about halfway up the stairs of Air Force One and looked over to my right, And underneath the wing, they were making the press discard all of their equipment, their cameras, their tape recorders, their computers, their laptops, their bags, and they had a bomb dog going over them. And they were making the press go onto the plane with nothing but what was on their person, and to check and see if somebody was trying to smuggle a bomb on board. And as they cleared equipment, they just went over and threw it into the bottom of Air Force One. So I got up to the top of the steps, and Air Force One's a 747, and you get on, and very few people go to the left. To the left is that room that Eric showed you with the bed and the head and the shower and couch where the president and Andy were having their discussion. Everybody turns to the right, and the first door is the president's private cabin, and the next door is the steps up to the cockpit, and then there's a medical unit, a galley, and then there's the senior staff cabin where Karen and Clay and I would hang out when we were on trips, and then there's a conference room, and then the seating for other people. I was on my way to the senior staff cabin, and I didn't get there because the president again whistled and motioned to sit across the chair from him in his private cabin. And I sort of sat down and sort of got ready, but I noticed it was really noisy. The engines were already revved up, and normally you never heard them because they'd button up the plane and then turn on, but the engines were already up, and people were running onto the plane and down the hallway, and then they stopped because they'd all entered, and the engines were revved up, and we started moving. All of a sudden, the stairs disappeared. They're on the back of a truck. I think they're on the back of a truck, and bang, they were gone. And the door is open, and we're moving. And I remember an airman comes running up the hallway of Air Force One and grabs a strap and leans out over 20 feet of air and grabs the door and pulls it shut and arms the door. And we're moving down the runway. I mean, we are moving. And we get to the end of the runway, and Colonel Tillman flips this plane around like it is a Cessna. I mean, just literally flips this big 747, guns the engines, and you can just hear the plane vibrating, and then let's go. And we go rocketing down the runway, and we get airborne, and that plane stands on its tail. And I'm sitting in the chair across from the president looking up at him, trying to be like, okay, everything's okay. Because they thought some guy might have a man pad, a shoulder-launched missile lying in wait at the end of the runway, and they wanted to get airborne as quickly as possible. So we did. And then we had this conversation. You saw the gentle parts of it. The president said, I'm going back to Washington. And Cheney said no. Rumsfeld said no. Secret Service said, Mr. President, we can't guarantee the airspace over Washington. Andy Card said no, and the president kept saying, I'm going to Washington. And Clay's known the president longer than any of us, and he's not an angry guy, but he came pretty close to being angry. I remember at one point he snapped at Eddie Morenzel, who came in to make the argument. He cut him off saying, Eddie, you tell Andy if he wants to make that argument to me again, come make it himself. And another point, Andy did make the argument, and he cut him off saying, I am the president. Like Andy needed to be reminded of that.
The first thing he said to me that day was, don't you think I need to get back there? And I said, yes, sir, I do. And he said, well, I'm coming next time. I'm not letting them keep me away anymore.
Yeah. Well, the guy who finally figured it out was Tom Gould, who was the Air Force officer. And he said, Mr. President, we don't have a full fuel load. We have too many people on board. We don't have a full fuel load. We get back to Washington and we're not able to land. We won't be able to orbit long enough. So we need to go to a nearby secure facility, drop unnecessary personnel, get a full fuel load, and then we can go to Washington. So if we can't land, then we can orbit. And it sounded good.
Where'd that one come from?
Yeah, but that was clearly a dodge because we're at this point over the northeast part of Florida, over near Cape Canaveral, and we got Naval Air Station Jacksonville north of us, and we got Eglin Air Force Base slightly to the west of us. And they say, Mr. President, the most secure facility is Barksdale Air Force Base, the headquarters of the 8th Air Force in northwestern Louisiana. And the reason was it was on not lockdown from the day before. There'd been a nuclear test drill, and so the entire base was already on lockdown and completely secure. So we land there, and Eric's right. We catch the signal. The local television station had sent a camera crew on the flight path into Barksdale, and they were the first people to know where we were. Nobody knows in America where we were except the local CBS affiliate in Shreveport, Louisiana. So much for security. And we land, and I remember, you know, landing at a military installation with any president is pretty amazing. You know, flags, music, snappy salutes, uniforms, you know, brass. I mean, it's really impressive. Not that day. We got off in the command structure. The 8th Air Force was there in their combat uniforms, every one of them with a sidearm, and I haven't seen that many guns since the South Texas hunting party. I mean, it was, everybody had a weapon. And I have to correct Eric, the president did not ride in a Humvee. The Humvee was the security vehicle. The president rode in a powder blue Dodge Mini Caravan, which is not very presidential. But there was an armed Humvee right behind him with a .50 caliber machine gun on top, and the place is deadly silent. And when the president's car begins to move, the airman manning the .50 cal puts a live round in the chamber. Just cocked it back and put a live round in the chamber, and you could hear it. It sounded like a bell. And at that point, the Time news reporter who was with us in the pool completely lost it. Came completely unglued. I thought I was in charge of the press trying to get him into the little vehicle we were getting into, and he came completely unglued, particularly when the president's vehicle sped out of the distance. That was Jay Carney, President Obama's press spokesman. Anyway, that was. I don't mean to. We need to go to Washington. Thoughts of things have happened in Washington in the meantime. But that was. By this time, it's about 11 o'clock in the morning, and we're in Shreveport, Louisiana, with a rather restive president desiring to get back to Washington.
So we'll come back to Louisiana in a moment. But Clay, you were in the White House that morning. Mm-hmm. Talk about the morning of 9/11 from your perspective.
Okay. There's a senior staff meeting at 7:30, and so get there at 7 or so, go down to the Roosevelt Room, 7:30, meeting over at 8. I had an appointment at my office on the second floor of the West Wing, and at 9 I was supposed to go down and see Tim Flanagan, who's the Deputy White House Counsel, to talk about some appointments matter. And as I was walking out of my office about a few minutes before 9, the assistants out there, there was a TV in the corner, and they showed the World Trade Towers and smoke coming out. I said, "What's that?" And they said, some private plane flew into the World Trade Towers. I said, "God, that's awful, wow." Down the hall, Flanagan, there were 3 or 4 of us in the meeting. At 9, whatever time, the second plane flew in, 9:13 or something. 9:03. So about 9:10, the woman comes in, his assistant comes in, hands him a note. He looks at it and says, "Another one?" Hands him back the note. The rest of us are. And he said, "What is it?" And he said, "A second plane." Then about that time, the assistant comes in and said, "We've been asked to go, all of us, don't go back to your office, go downstairs to the White House mess, which is on the lower floor, which is the most underground, the lowest large space in the White House, and gather there." And I did stop long enough. I called Ann and said, "Turn on the TV." Hung up. So we're down there. Couldn't have been more than 5 minutes. Someone comes in and says, "Everybody, women, take off your heels. Everybody, leave the north gate, go across to the other side of Lafayette Square. Don't tell you what to do. Just go to the north side and go over there." So we all, and they said, "Go fast, as fast as you can go." So we do that, and then we're over there, and now what? Now what do we do? And Anita McBride, who's Laura's chief of staff, was chief of staff, said, "My husband works over here, Daimler Chrysler, the office is about 4 blocks, lots of spare rooms. Let's go over there." So a bunch of people went over there, probably 30 or 40, and it grew to probably double that in the morning. And we were over there. Nick Callio, who's legislative affairs assistant to the president, me, there were Anita, we over there and watching on televisions. And we're just stunned like everybody else in America was. So that's what was going on until about noon when we came back, and we'll cover that when you go to the next phase.
Now, Karen, you were neither with the president nor at the White House, but like many of us, you were at home.
Very unusual. Almost any other morning of my entire time at the White House, I would have been either with the president or at the White House. but September 10th is my wedding anniversary. And so I had decided to stay in Washington with my husband so we could have an anniversary dinner. We'd never missed an anniversary before. And my deputy traveled to Florida with the president. And so when it became clear that I wasn't going to Florida, Mel Martinez, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, asked me to represent the White House at a Habitat for Humanity event that morning. And it was going to be a build, and so we were supposed to wear your blue jeans and your t-shirt, and President Bush, out of respect for the office, didn't allow blue jeans in the West Wing. So I had taken the opportunity to sleep a little late and missed that 7:30 horrible senior staff meeting. And I was literally I was supposed to be at the Habitat event at 9:30, and so I was just stepping out of the shower when the phone rang. And it was my assistant at the White House who told my husband, will you tell Karen that a plane has hit the World Trade Center? Well, my husband knows me well enough to know that something like that would just prompt a whole host of questions that he couldn't answer. So he said, you better tell her yourself, and took the phone to the shower and handed it to me as I was stepping out. And so, you know, my mind was small plane, heart attack, terrible accident. I said to my assistant, have you called Dan, who was my deputy with the president? And she said, I just did before I called you. And so I hung up the phone and called Dan, and who was with the president in the room, where you saw the pictures with Eric. I turned on the television, and as I did, saw the second plane hit the second tower. And I remember my first instinct was to drop to my knees and say a prayer for the people in the building. And somebody later asked me, why not the people on the airplane? It never occurred to me there were people on the airplane. I mean, it was just too horrific. So I immediately called Dan, and I said, Dan, a second plane has hit the second tower. And so that's when he pointed at the TV for all of you all in Florida. I called Dan and said, a second plane has hit the second tower. And I'll never forget this question because it struck me as such a guy kind of question. He said, what kind of plane? And I said, I don't know. I said, a big plane like a passenger plane. Never again occurring to me that it was in fact a passenger plane. And so I then spent the next, I was on the phone with Dan. We agreed that the president had to make a statement. I thought when they left Florida that they were coming back to Washington. I was not aware that the vice president and Andy had recommended that he not come back so Dan and I were planning through, he's got to call the mayor of New York, he's got to call the governor, we've got to activate the federal emergency response, and I knew I had to get to the White House. But I didn't know where to go. The TV was reporting that the White House I was on the phone actually with my assistant Jill Angelo, and she said the Secret Service is telling us we have to leave. And I could hear them yelling in the background. And then I said, well, get out of there, go. And so she, along with the others, ran from the White House. And then there was this strange silence. I didn't know what to do. I knew I had to get to work, but they were reporting that downtown Washington was being shut down and evacuated. The White House had been evacuated. There were false reports of a car bomb at the State Department. I started getting pages to call, you're needed at the emergency center now. Well, I had never seen the emergency center. I had no idea where it was or what it was. We'd only been there 7 months. I'd never had the tour, so the disaster preparation. Then I got a page called Signal. Well, so I asked my husband kind of a stupid question, do you know the number for Signal? And he said, what's Signal? And I'd always called the White House operator, but the White House operator had been evacuated with the White House. And so I didn't know how to call. And so they were sending me all these pages, but I wasn't aware of how to get in touch with them. And so I decided, well, in the meantime, I realized that my son would see the news and worry, because he frequently texted me called me from school and when something major happened on the news. And so I asked my husband to call my son and tell him I was okay. I was at home. And as he started to look up the number, the phone rang, and it was our son, and he said, come get me. And so I thought, well, while I'm trying to get in touch, I'll go make sure we pick up Robert. It was real close, and we went to pick up Robert. And finally, I got a number and called, and the vice president said, I need you to call the plane. They're on the way to Louisiana, and they're going to make a statement. They're working on a statement. And he indicated, there was something that he said that indicated to me he didn't think he liked it or I would like it. And so I called the plane, I got a hold of Ari, and I asked Ari to read me the statement. And the first line said, America today was the victim of. And I just had this horrible reaction. I was like, we are not victims. Our country, we may have been attacked, but our country is not a victim. And so we were working on the statement and, talking the whole time. And finally, when I talked to the vice president, he had said he would send a military driver to bring me back to downtown Washington. And it seemed like it took forever. The traffic was horrible in Washington, as you can imagine. The driver got me. I went back into downtown Washington, and as you can imagine, mine was the only car headed that way. Everybody else was fleeing the city. I could see the Pentagon burning over the driver, and I realized as I'm sitting there that he must have very good friends there. And I said to him, I'm sure you have a lot of friends there. This is a horrible day for our country. And he said, yes, ma'am. And, it was just sort of silence. So we could see the Pentagon burning. We got to downtown, along the way, I got a page from Ron Fournier, who's the Associated Press reporter who covered the White House, always on top of things, and wanted to know what was going on. And I realized that the American people, all they were seeing was chaos. The White House shut down, the State Department shut down, and I realized we've got to make a statement. We've got to explain what our government is doing to respond to these. And I knew if I talked to the president, he would say that was fine. And so I tried to call the plane. And at that point, we'd traveled with the president a lot of different places. I'd seen him make calls all over the world from Air Force One. And I finally got a hold of the signal operator and said, I need to talk to the president. And for what seemed like an eternity, there's silence. And finally she comes back on and her voice was shaking and she said, ma'am, we cannot reach Air Force One. I'd never had that happen before. And of course, I can't remember if at that point the threat to Angel, the plane, had been relayed to me. I think it had. And so for a few moments there, I really thought something could have happened to the president and all my friends on Air Force One. And we drove further and further, and we got to downtown Washington, and it was just the most chilling. Clay and I were talking backstage. It was in some ways some of the most chilling images of the day because there was nobody out. And on every corner, there were men dressed in black holding these big weapons, and that's all you could see. That was all that was moving in downtown Washington. And so it looked like a foreign capital after a coup. There was a lighthearted moment. We got to the first perimeter checkpoint, and the military driver said to the guard, who came up very suspiciously with his gun pointed at the car because they were worried about suicide bombers. The military driver said, I have Karen Hughes, and I'm taking her to the vice president. And I heard the guy wasn't about to let me through. He radioed his supervisor. His supervisor, I heard him come back and say, how do you know it's Karen Hughes? Are you sure it's Karen Hughes? And the officer looked in the car and said, yep, I've seen her on TV. So a rare lighthearted moment that day. I finally get to the White House after several more checkpoints, and they dropped me off at the east side, which is not where we usually went in. We went in the west side, and nobody was there. And so I said to the driver, what do I do? And he said, well, go in and they'll take you to wherever you're supposed to go. Well, I'd never seen, if the president's there, the Marine is always standing guard at the door. There's always somebody there. I walked in, there's nobody there. There's no receptionist, there's nobody. And I thought, well, this is not a good day to be sneaking into the White House. And so I sort of yelled, hello, is anybody here? I didn't know what to do. And I hear these heavy footsteps, guys running down the hall, and their weapons are drawn as I walk into the door and yell, is anybody here? Explained who I was. They led me through a series of tunnels and facilities to get to the Emergency Operations Center. And each one, it's like a submarine door closing, the pressurized sense, you get the feeling. And I got to the Presidential Operations Center, and when I walked in, what immediately struck me was in contrast to the chaos that I'd been watching on television and hearing in the news reporting, it was completely calm. The vice president was on the phone. The Secretary of Transportation, Norm Mineta, was on the phone. They were talking to the president. They were grounding the planes. They were activating the emergency response. They were putting the embassies on alert. They were sending rescue teams to New York. And my immediate thought, again, as a communicator, was, I've got to communicate this to the public. I've got to explain to people what I'm seeing here. And so, then I began working with our staff that was in the bunker, trying to gather up stories from all of the cabinet agencies about what they were doing to respond. Because I remember thinking, facts and action will be comforting. People need to hear what the government's doing, and I need to talk to them about facts and action. And I knew once I could get a hold of the president that he would say, of course, go out and brief. And I finally did, as you were traveling between Louisiana and Nebraska, was the first time I talked to him. And as I said, the first thing he said to me was, "Don't you think I need to come back there?" And I said, "Yes, sir," because I did. And I didn't know about the security threats. I mean, that wasn't my job. My job was the job of communicating to the public, and I thought it was important for the president to be in Washington. So he said, of course, go out and brief. And so then we began the process of assembling the materials for my statement. And I remember feeling a huge responsibility. First of all, I didn't want to be the one to make the statement. I'd be happy to write it, but I didn't think it should be me that made it. And the vice president was adamant. He was like, "No, it has to be you." And I thought maybe it should be him or Condi Rice. But I think they were very conscious of not having an Al Haig moment. And if any of you remember the moment when President Reagan was shot and Al Haig went to the White House press room to announce that, "Don't worry, everything's fine, I'm here.
I'm in charge here.
I'm in charge here," exactly.
I'm
and
in
so
command.
they didn't, and the vice president said to me, "No, people are used to you. They know they know you speak for the president." And I think also nobody thought I was trying to pull off any coup or anything. I wasn't trying to be in charge there or take over in any way. And so the Secret Service, though, wouldn't let me brief from the White House briefing room. They thought it was too dangerous. So they literally surrounded me, 5 agents or 6 around me like a shield with their guns drawn, and they walked me out of the White House into a car and took me to the Justice Department. And I'd never had anything like that happen before. I remember as I prepared the statement, and one other little detail about the statement, there was a computer in the bunker. And so I was writing my statement on the computer, and it wasn't until I came time to print the statement out that I realized that this printer probably hadn't been used since, the 1960s or something, maybe the Cuban Missile Crisis, I don't know, but it barely printed. It was like barely legible. And so I still have a copy of it, the original's in the archives, but a copy of the statement, you can barely read it because there was almost no ink in the printer in the bunker. But I remember feeling a huge responsibility to try to be calm and decisive and in command, for a badly shaken country. So I think that was probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my professional career. We had discussed it and decided that I couldn't take questions. And of course, we knew that would make the media really mad because they hated not to be able to ask questions. But all the information that we had confidence in was in my statement. And we knew that my inability to answer, the first question would be, who did this? And I couldn't answer it at that point. And my inability to answer would be detrimental to our mission to try to reassure people and instill a sense of calm.
Right. Karl, let's go back to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. President Bush, when he talks or writes about 9/11, talks about the fog of war that he was experiencing. Can you talk a little bit about what was happening at that base and what the president was feeling and experiencing?
Yeah, well, there is a fog of war, and Karen and Clay alluded to it. There was the report about the attack on the State Department with a car bomb. There was this talk of the attack on Angel, and what turned out to have happened was, look, whenever you have an incident, I don't care how big or little it is, there's a nut out there in America who calls the Secret Service and makes a threat. And what had happened is, in the aftermath of the attacks on the World Trade Center, somebody picked up the phone and called and said, the Air Force One is next. And as this got reported up the chain of command, somewhere in the chain of command, somebody invoked Angel. Somebody took the code word, the then code word for Air Force One, and said, the threat is that Angel is next. And this gave it obviously greater credibility than just some nut calling the switchboard saying, I'm going to get the president. But, there is a fog of war. But what got me that day was the clarity of certain things. Andy and I were sitting there, and the president got a phone call, and we could only hear, obviously, his side of the conversation. And it was Cheney. Didn't know that until afterwards. But the president said, yes. Listened for a while. Yes. Listened for a few moments more. Said, you have my authorization. Yes. Listened for a few more moments and then hung up. And in about as even a tone of voice as a human being can have, he said, I've just given authorization for the military to shoot down any aircraft inbound to a critical target not under the command of its crew. And I remember just sort of like moment of horror. And I think he was chewing a cigar, and he said something to the effect, I can't remember the words because it was such an awful moment. He said something about how terrible it would be to be a young pilot to get that order. But there was such clarity about the necessity of it. So yeah, there was a fog of war. When we got to Barksdale, and Karen and Ari and Dan and everybody worked over the statement, and he then gave it. He said, I'm coming home. I'm coming to Washington. And they said, Mr. President, we can't guarantee the security of the airspace. He said, I'm coming to Washington. They said, Mr. President, we've dispersed the government. Cheney's in the PIOC. Rumsfeld is now secure. FBI director secure. CIA director. All of these people are in secure facilities. The Secretary of State is in South America, Peru. So they said, Mr. President, if we can fly you to Offutt Air Force Base, we have facilities there that allow us to link everybody together by secure video conference. It's the nearest facility. We can't do it at Barksdale. We can do it at Offutt. So, Mr. President, how about if you fly to Offutt? It's an hour and 15 minutes away, closer than Washington, and then you can be briefed by everybody. We'd had a briefing there. Eric had the picture of it, and there was a video link, but you had to be in one of those facilities. If you look closely at that photograph, there's not very many important people in those facilities. Today, President Obama travels with a Halliburton case that's about this size and about this deep, and he can plug it into any internet outlet, any cable TV outlet, and have a secure video conference with a number of people simultaneously all around the world. But back then, the technology was such that this was the closest we could go. So we fly to Offutt, and the president is steaming, and he said, "Look, I know this is just a dodge. This is the last time that they're going to be able to pull this off." So we get to Offutt, and we land at Offutt, which is a Cold War, headquarters of SAC, and it's got these impossibly long runways. They look like, concrete roads, they go on for miles. And so the Air Force One goes off to this corner of the field away from any building, except there's like what looks like a telephone equipment shed right there. And we get off the plane and we go over to the telephone equipment shed, which is about the size of, for one person to walk into to work on your phone equipment. And we walk in and go down about 300, 400 feet into this facility designed to withstand a nuclear blast way under the Omaha Prairie, Nebraska Prairie. And we walk in, and it's like out of Dr. Strangelove. We walk in, and there's like this 3-story electronic board, and we're up here, and the president then goes down to the floor of this facility, and they have this gigantic board, and they then link him in, and then they describe what's going on. And this is the fog of war. 7 aircraft inbound over the Atlantic with their transponders not squawking, thought to be under the control of hijackers. One is 30 minutes outside of Philadelphia, and aircraft have been scrambled, and if they can't divert the aircraft off the New Jersey coast, they have orders to shoot it down. There's supposedly a aircraft on the tarmac in Yellowknife in the Yukon Territory under the control of hijackers, and Canadian Special Forces are inbound to retake control of the plane. And of course, none of this is true. But this is also the first time where Al-Qaeda is mentioned by George Tenet. Very strong suggestion that Al-Qaeda is behind this, given the 1993 bombings. And so they finish, and the president says, "I'm coming home." And they say the same old arguments again, and the president says he's had enough of it. And he says, basically, I have confidence in you. Do your best. But the nation needs to hear from me from the Oval Office, not from some bunker underneath, the prairies of Nebraska. And he was pretty blunt about it. But I thought it was interesting that he started off by saying, do your best. I have confidence in you. Typical Bush style. So we go back.
I remember being struck at how the first time I saw him that day, after I talked with him on the phone, but I saw him, was from Nebraska. And he convened a meeting of the National Security Council via teleconference. And normally I would not be part of the National Security Council, but that day he wanted me in the room, and for several weeks afterward we did. But I'll never forget the moment I saw him. He practically came through the TV screen and he said, "We are at war against terror, and from this day forward, this is the new priority of our administration." And I just remember the clarity of thought and the focus and the steely determination. And that was the time at which George Tenet first mentioned Al-Qaeda. When he finished, he said he was coming home and start working on an address.
Yeah. So we go back up. Now we don't have to walk up the stairs. I think we went up in an elevator. Draper would remember. Yeah, so we go up in the elevator, and we get out, and we're actually in a different part of the facility. So they're actually buildings, and they've got a motorcade, makeshift motorcade, thrown together by the Omaha office, the Secret Service, and the ARC guys. So we get in this motorcade to drive back across the airport to where they've repositioned the plane, loaded up, and with fuel and everything. And as we're driving there, I'm not in the limo. I'm in my normal space, which is can't remember the name of the car right now. But anyway, I'm about four behind. And as we're driving across this impossibly long runway, I mean, it's about half a mile wide and is like 6 miles long. We're driving on it, and I out of the corner of the eye, I see a fuel truck moving to intercept our, and it looks like about when it's going to get to us, it's going to hit our car. So I'm saying, I've come this far, and I'm going to be immolated in a fire truck, in a fuel truck explosion. So anyway, he stops. At some point, some Air Force security guy jumps out of a vehicle and makes him stop. But we get on the plane, we're flying back, and the president is working through the statement with Karen and Condi and others via telephone. They're faxing it to the plane and talking over the phone and so forth. But finally, that finishes, and he's pretty well satisfied with noodling on it. And so we're all sort of decompressing for a minute. He goes forward to take a power nap. And I'm standing in the corridor of the plane with somebody. I can't remember who it was, but we were looking out, just absentmindedly looking out to the left-hand side of the plane, and up plows the F-16. And my colleague is really excited about it and says, you know, get your camera, get your camera, get your camera. And so I went back into the president's office, and there was an aircraft on the right-hand side as well. And I went back and we're taking pictures of it and thinking this was really cool. And then we got sober real quick because we realized this was not a ceremonial escort. We'd entered what was called the National Capital Airspace, and these guys had drawn the black bean, and they were the last line of defense. If something came towards Air Force One that got through the outer fighter cover, these guys' jobs were to put their plane between whatever that threat was and Air Force One. So they were not ceremonial. And you saw the pictures that Eric took. Several years later, I was going through the Atlanta airport, and this very trim guy comes up to me and says, "Are you Karl Rove?" And I said, "Yeah," and he introduced himself. He said, "We were together on September 11th. I said, "Really? Where were you?" He said, "I was on your left wingtip." He was a stockbroker, the Air Reserve, who'd been on active duty that day, and he was on our left side. So we got back into Washington. And they were still nervous about the airspace over Washington. So Colonel Tillman brought in Air Force One, and I kid you not, it was the reverse of the takeoff. We're going down like this. I mean, he didn't go like we're like this. And again, I'm in the same place. I'm strapped in across from the president, looking down at him, trying to be calm. And at the last minute, Tillman, pancakes us onto the runway. It was the most incredible feet of flying I've ever seen. He just pancakes it onto the runway, and we're safe on the ground at Andrews. So we go to get on Marine One, and there are actually 3 Marine Ones. There's Marine One and 2 other helicopters. They look exactly alike. They're all Sikorsky green helicopters with white tops, and they all take off at roughly the same time out of Andrews. They get to 600, 800, 1,200 feet, and then there's a leisurely ballet of the, sort of like the old peas in the pod, where's the pea, and they have this ballet that takes place, and they come into the Washington. It's a very leisurely drive. It's a great way to get to and from the airport, I found. No frequent flyer miles, but easier than finding a parking space. And you're flying in, and then the 2 break off, and one of them goes to land on the south lawn. But they get up there pretty high, and it's a wonderful view. Well, not that day. We got about 5 feet off the ground in Marine One. And we started making our way off of Andrews Air Force Base by going down the greens on the golf course, and with treetops above us. I mean, we were literally 5 feet off the ground, and we're weaving our way off the base. And we get to the fence line. Andrews is in the Maryland suburbs, so it's surrounded on 2-3 sides by just suburbs. And we get to the fence line in Marine One, and I'll never forget it. the pilot we're going 20, 30 miles an hour. We get to that fence line and he just punches it. And we come charging out of that fence line, and I'm sitting, the president is sitting forward looking and backward looking chair across from him. I'm sitting on a bench across from him, so I'm looking out the window and I see out of the fence line 100 yards to the north of us explodes another Sikorsky helicopter just like that, right out of the trees. And we're going 160 miles an hour pretty damn quick, and we are in the nap of the earth. We are as close to the ground as you can get, making our way into Washington by hugging the earth. And at one point I'm looking out and there are apartment buildings to the right and houses to the left, and they're above us because we're in this valley just streaking over the parkway. And at one point it looks like we're going to go under a bridge, and at the last minute he pulls it up and over. And I mean it's exhilarating, but it's scary as hell and unusual. So we come over the last ridge line separating Maryland from the Potomac. We come up and over, and there's an Air Force base there at a Marine Air and Marine Joint Command where they have HMX-1, Marine 1. And we come barreling through Bolling Air Force Base at ground level. If there were cars on 295, we would have been knocking out their windows. And we are maneuvering at this high speed through the buildings at Bolling Air Force Base. And we're about ready, it looks like, to land in the Potomac. And at the last second, the pilot pulls a hard right, so hard I can feel the G's in a helicopter. And at that moment, the Pentagon comes into view. It's about 6:30, 6:40 in the evening. And there's smoke pouring out of the Pentagon, and you can see the smoke, and we go through the plume of smoke. Nobody has said a single word the entire flight until that moment. And the president very quietly said, "Take a look, you're looking at the face of war of the 21st century." And at that, we came up and over the south lawn of the White House, below the Washington Monument. We were below the break between the 1834 break between the building it and not building it. We were below that. And we come up and over and land on the south lawn. The president has a speech at 8:30. My last contribution of the day was there was a line in the speech that reflected how many people had died. And we realized we didn't know how many. And I've been talking to Pataki and Giuliani during the day, so I volunteered to call them and find out. I remember calling Giuliani's phone, and his guy, Tony Carbonetti, answered the phone. And I said, we got the speech, we're going to mention how many people died. And I can remember the odd sense of relief when he said, well, we think about 3,100. I mean, it's terrible to say that, but the thought was, each of those buildings held like 15,000 people worked in those buildings. So the idea that on that day, 3,100 people, I can remember the sort of a palpable sense of relief, and we stuck the number in, we said thousands, and put the speech to bed.
Clay, what was happening at the White House that afternoon prior to the president's arrival that evening?
Well, as I said, we were over, there were
with the White House staff.
75 people or so, the Daimler Chrysler building, half a dozen blocks away from the White House, and a couple of people have been in communication with their counterparts in the PIAC, and they said about noon that they wanted to bring the assistance to the president. There were 4 or 5 of us back over there. You talk about Alexander Haig. When we got in there into the Daimler Chrysler spaces, Kristen Silverberg from Austin, and really neat person, came up to me and said, "Clay, I think I'm pretty sure you're the tallest person here, but I think you're also the senior most person here. Why don't you get up and kind of get us organized?" And I'm thinking, no.
Remind me to get in the foxhole with you next time, Bubba.
No, anyway. But Karen was talking about the street. So walking back, the half a dozen of us went downstairs about noon. We were escorted over to the east wing of the White House. And there were no cars, no people. Weirdest thing. And you looked at every intersection. It's like if you could look 8 blocks down this way, there were 8 heavily armed people in black, one at each intersection. No cars, nothing. Dogs were sniffing all the trash cans. And the agent that escorted us back there was the largest human being I've ever seen. And had arms and guns and just was huge. And I thought, well, maybe, as I thought about it a week or two later I thought, well, maybe I was just so glad. I imagined him to be Superman. And then I would see him all the time. He really was that big. I mean, he was just an incredible guy. So anyway, we go in the Peoc, and I remember walking in, and you walk into the briefing room there, or the small conference room, and I see the vice president sitting down, and Karen on one side and Connie on the other. And I said, well, this guy is being really well served with two really talented people. So we got lots of expertise on the phone to help the president make really good decisions here. And Norm Mineta was sitting on the other side. He's a wonderful, wonderful guy. And so there was conversation and communication and then occasional visit with the president and so forth and so on. So this was going on. Something is fog of war. So Norm is there. He's closed down, told every flight to land. And there are a bunch of TV screens behind him. And he says, he puts down the phone and he says, Mr. Vice President, we have it on good authority that it was a private plane that flew into the Pentagon. And as he's saying that, literally as he's uttering the words, CNN, yes, it was Delta flight or American flight, whatever. So here is the head of the transportation department who doesn't know as much as CNN does. And so Norm was a really good transportation secretary, wonderful guy, really just the best you can imagine. And so it wasn't a competence thing, it was just fog of war. It was just, what are the next targets? And so the staff is wondering, then they're milling about. And so then towards the latter part of the afternoon, mid 4:30, Josh Bolton said, you go do this, Clay, and da-da-da. Call this person, get him out there, and let's communicate with the governors, and then do some intergovernmental stuff. And then so he was kind of assembling some things. And so when we could go back into the offices in the White House about 5, I think, or 5:30, and so we went back and started doing our tasks. And we knew the president was going to speak at, what, you said 8:30? And so I think most everybody stayed until he'd spoken and just watched it on television and went home. And I remember walking in, and Ann and some people were there, and it just wasn't like, what was it like? I mean, the questions were, there were no questions. It was just the seriousness of it, the gravity of it. One of the things I'm asked, I think everybody's asked this who served in the administration, is how do you know what to do when something like this, 9/11 happens? Or how do you know what to do when this thing happens or that unbelievable thing happens? And all I know is what I saw at every turn was incredible professionalism. I mean, I saw you and Condi, with the vice president, and there was no panic, there was no nothing. There was the taking care of business. It was focusing on what we're trying to do. Norm Mineta's working the phones. You talk about the president, the voice, to taking control, communicating what it is, getting firm in everybody's mind, what the situation is, what the priorities were. It was really professional, really, really professional.
Eric talked about the president's almost preternatural calm in the face of this crisis. You, as I believe Karl mentioned, have known the president longer than anyone on the panel, since your days at Phillips Exeter and then on to Yale.
Andover.
Andover, excuse me.
He went to Exeter.
What about the president, your experience with the president, would lead you to believe that he would be able to rally the nation as he did in that moment?
Yeah, well, it's a goofy parallel. I think the primary thing about the president that people always had a sense of about him in high school, college, and every policy person he ever worked for, that ever worked for him as governor or president, was, in any kind of briefing, the president's there, and he is, by definition, the least knowledgeable person on whatever the subject is. Any subject, he's the least knowledgeable. But every policy person said, when you asked him at the end of a meeting, who was the wisest person in that meeting? And they would say, well, it was the president. Well, why would you say that? You know way more than he does. He said, you'd give him 8, 10, 12 key facts or something. It made no difference what the subject was. He could say, isn't the real key to this that flower?
He always asked the question that got right to the heart of the matter.
It was just right.
Always.
And so the way I thought of it is just watching it on news and hearing you all tell the stories who were with him. That's another example of that. This is if we're at war, we have to give a talk, we have to give a speech, we have to rally to this and that, so forth. And so it's not like, what do we do? It was just understanding immediately what's required, what's called for, the gravity of the situation, getting back, the messaging, what the military is doing, et cetera, et cetera. Just the comfort level with what the task at hand. The worst situation can be is not knowing what to do, or not knowing, gosh, what do I do now? I don't know, it's so, complicated. He just immediately grasped it and wrapped both arms around it. And
He said he had great clarity. I mean, I remember the day after 9/11, I walked into the Oval Office and he looked at me and said, "Let me tell you how to do your job today." And he very logically said, "We're at war, and so you are in charge of communicating this war." And people are, already he's thinking 5 steps ahead. People are going to get weary, but I'm not. We have to prepare them for how long this is and what a process this is. And, he has great clarity of thought, I think. And that results in a very steely determination and a great deal of a calm environment.
Let's go back. Eric led up to the 14th of September in his presentation, and that very dramatic visit to New York. You were with the president, both, Karl, you were with the president, and Karen, you were as well. What are your recollections of that day?
Well, first, I just remember the horror of seeing it. You could still, as our helicopters got closer, you could smell it. It permeated the air, the smell, the horror of the sight. I mean, we'd seen it so much on TV, but somehow just being there, it was so, I loved Eric's description. It was like standing on a raw nerve. It was just the emotion and I emailed a friend when I got home that night and I said that I was struck by 3 things. First of all, horror. I mean, because being there, you really saw the horror of the situation. And I remember thinking, how could anybody, no matter their training, no matter their zealousness, no matter what they believed, how could they not pull up before flying a plane into that building full of people? And, and the second emotion was terrible sadness. It was so sad, all the people that had lost loved ones, and you could see it, you could feel the visceral anger and sadness at the site as the workers, we had not planned for the president to speak at Ground Zero because he had given very eloquent remarks earlier the day at the National Prayer Service, and that was supposed to be the remarks for the day. But it became very clear, as Eric said, that people wanted to hear from their president, and there was nothing scripted. It was completely spontaneous on his part.
Yeah, it's actually an accident. It's a complete accident. All due to a little woman named Nina Bishop.
Nina Bishop.
Nina Bishop is a White House advance person. She was assigned to State Department. She is about 5'6". She's a biker married to a bike messenger, so she has 0 body fat. And if you took a foam fire hose and wet her for about an hour, she might be 90 pounds. The night before, there had been a meeting of the advance team, and they had decided that there wasn't going to be any remarks because he had this major speech at the National Cathedral. And Nina disagreed. Nina thought the president needed to speak. And so she consciously thought through what member of the president's senior staff was most manipulatable, most malleable, most prone to give in to her idea, and that was me. So we come into the Northwest. We first visited the southeast corner of Ground Zero, and Karen's right. I mean, we were 30 miles south of New York when we entered the plume of smoke. The prevailing wind was from north to south, and you could just smell it. For 30 miles, we had the cabin on Nighthawk 2, which was the chopper that Karen and I were on with Ari Fleischer. It was just a critic. You could just smell it. And we went first to the southwest corner, which is where the facing from the 110th floor of the World Trade Center literally was stabbed into the ground like some gigantic trident. And then we went around in the northwest corner, which was where they were pulling out all of the rubble. And that's where Nina was. And so we pulled on a little street south, going north to south. The motorcade is only 4 or 5 vehicles. And it goes south for a half a block and then turns right. and there's only enough room for 2 vehicles to turn to the right, and so there are 3 or 4 vehicles behind. And I remember when we pulled into this little street, it felt like there was a hum. We were not in normal vehicles, we were in armored SUVs, and so I felt like there was this hum. And I suspect you had the same feeling. When you opened the door, you realized it wasn't a hum, it was the sound of this crowd, and it was unbelievable. It was like you were hit with a wall of sound, and they were chanting USA, USA. And I got out of the vehicle and walked to the front and looked to my left, and there was Cardinal Egan, who's a pal of mine, with the religious leadership of the city of New York, you know, Hasidim Jews, you know, Orthodox, you know, blah, 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 blah. All of them waving U.S. flags and all of them chanting USA. And I mean, it was like completely emotional. And I almost lost it. I mean, because you couldn't look at these men. There was Cardinal Egan weeping. And at that moment, I felt this tug, and I turned around, and it's Nina. And Nina says, they want to hear their president. He needs to speak. And it was a sensible idea. I said, you're right. Do we have a sound system? She said, no. I said, where do you want him to speak from? She said, I don't know. He just needs to speak. What about the running boards? And there were wide running boards on these SUVs, but he'd only be this far off the ground. So I said, you go get a bullhorn. Go get, can you get a bullhorn? She said, yeah, I can get one. I said, go get a bullhorn. And I looked around. Before I went to Andy, I wanted to have a place for the president to stand. And I'm not an advanced guy. I don't script well. But I turned around, and there was this fire truck. I remember right below me, it said 76 Engine Company. That was the top of the truck. It had been smashed down, this huge fire truck, so that it was no more than maybe 6 feet tall with a bunch of rubble on top. 3 guys standing on top of it. But it's visible to everything. So I wanted to make certain when I went to Andy, I had an idea. So I look up at these 3 guys, and as I look at them, there are 3 guys, an old guy, a Latino guy, and an Anglo guy, and the Anglo jumps off the back of the truck. So there are 2 guys standing on the top of this truck, and I'm sitting there in my suit and tie and buttoned up. And so I look at these guys and I say, is this thing stable? And they look at me like, you're the man from Mars. And I said, is this thing stable? And the Latino guy says, yeah, stable. And I said, jump up and down. Now they really look at me weird. But they jump up and down, and it looks stable enough. And so I said, stay there. Somebody may need your help. And I went to remove when they jumped up and down, there was a paving block near the bottom on top of the tires had been blown out by the pressure. They had literally exploded. So the tire wheel was down here, and on top of it, there was a paving block that jiggled. So I went to take the paving block and throw it away so that the president wouldn't step on it. And when I did so, the policeman standing next to me grabbed my hand and said, don't move it, there may be a body part underneath. So I went to Andy and said to Andy, they want to hear the president. He needs to speak to this crowd. Andy immediately said, you're right. That wasn't my idea, it was Nina's idea. And he said, where? And I said, well, he can do it over here. And at that moment, Nina shows up with the bullhorn commandeered from a Con Edison guy and gives it to the president's aide. And at this point, the Latino jumps off the back of the truck. And the 69-year-old retired firefighter, Bob Beckwith, is paying no attention to what's going on. He's just sort of looking out over the crowd. The president makes his way over and puts his hand up, and somebody yells to Bob, and Bob looks down, and all he sees is some guy trying to make his way up this pile of rubble. And so he reaches down and pulls the guy up standing next to him and realizes it's the president of the United States, and completely freaks out. So this is why the president has to sort of throw his arm around him and say, no, you're not going anywhere. And this guy's like, ah, the president. And of course, then there's the famous moment, the colloquy between our guy from Pittsburgh and the president, and the words that no speechwriter had anything to do with. Nobody thought about it in advance. Nobody pre-planned this moment. It just happened. And and when he said it, the wall of noise that had been there before sounded like a whisper compared to what exploded out of that crowd. Karen said she felt sadness. I felt anger that day. I had to fight it. I was so mad at what had happened. And in that moment, you could just hear the anger come out of these iron workers and steel workers and firemen and policemen. I mean, it just came out. They'd seen too many of their comrades and pulled too many bodies from the ashes and seen too many body parts, and they were just angry. And but it was like a calming moment when the president said they're going to hear from us. It was reassuring to people.
It was an incredible moment. I remember I was standing as close as I am to Karl right now, and the minute he said it, I was standing with our friend Joe Albaugh, who is the head of the Emergency Management Agency, and I turned to Joe and I said, "That's going to be in this presidential library someday," because I realized it was just the words were spoken with such a resolute conviction at such an important time, and the emotion it just was a perfect message for the moment. And then afterwards, we went, again, for many of us, I think the most intense and saddest experience of the whole day, we went to the Javits Center, where there were about 400 people. These were loved ones of first responders who had not yet been found. And so they were, the mothers, wives, children, brothers, fathers of missing police and firefighters who were at that point 3 days in, it was very unlikely, although there was still some hope, but very unlikely that any of them would still be found alive. And they were all there in the Javits Center. And we walked into that room, and it was just the most intense moment I'd ever experienced in my life. It was totally silent. It was so overwhelmingly sad. And I stood in there about 20 minutes. The president started going around family to family and very quietly sort of putting his arm around them, asking them about their loved one. After about 20 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. It was so, I felt like I was going to explode. It was so intense in there. And so I left the room for a few minutes. And he kept working, going from family to family, talking. When I walked back in, probably 20 or 30 minutes later, the entire mood had changed. He had managed to get people to talk about their loved ones. He had a few people even laughing. Tell me a story about your dad, or and he cried with each family and he laughed. And we were actually traveling with Kirby John Caldwell, who's a reverend from Houston, who looked at me and said, "He does this better than almost any pastor I know." And it was just amazing, the depth of the connection. And imagine the emotional wear and tear. I couldn't stand it. I mean, imagine the emotional wear and tear on the president. He spent almost 2 hours.
He spent more. He spent nearly 2.5 hours.
No, other than Eric, no media, nobody ever, I don't remember anybody ever writing a story about it. Never told anywhere. And at the end of somewhere during the process, somebody came up to me and introduced me to Arlene Howard and said, "This is the mother of a Port Authority officer, and she wants to give her son's badge to the president." And so I arranged for her to be positioned where she could see him as he was leaving. And she gave him the badge, which became a very powerful part, not only something for him. He was carrying it around and pulling it out of his pocket, and I realized that was very important to him, and we ended up concluding his joint session speech to Congress with the story of the badge. He said, "And I will carry this. It is my reminder of lives ended and a task that does not end." But at the end, the third emotion I had that day and I agree with you, Karl, there was such anger there. I remember the horror and the sadness, but at the end, as our motorcade left the city that night, what a powerful sense of inspiration. I don't know if you remember, but we left and it was dark after we left the Javits Center. And there were thousands of New Yorkers lining the streets, and they were holding candles, and they were shouting, "Thank you to the volunteers," and "God bless America." And it was such a powerful feeling. I just remember leaving the city with such amazing inspiration.
Yeah, 10 and 12 deep. It really was remarkable. I had a similar experience to Karen's when, first of all, it's not fair to call it a room that he entered a room. It was the parking garage, and they had taken pipe and drape and roped off an area big enough for these 400 family members to be inside. But I mean, this was not a room with comfortable chairs and a nice carpet on the floor to sit. This was a parking garage in the middle of a convention center, and Karen described it. I'll admit it. I was weeping uncontrollably after 15 minutes and had to leave. And I think only 2 people were in that room for the full 2.5 hours. One of them was the president, and, well, Secret Service, of course, so they may have shifted in and out. and Joe Hagan, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Administration at the White House, who's in charge of the advance operation. But I got to tell you, I remember when I had to leave the room the first time. I had to leave the room several times, but a little kid, he was blonde. I remember him, he was blonde, really blonde. And he came up and confronted the president and held up with both of his hands the picture of his father, police officer, and never said a word, just held it up to the president. And the president talked to him and then took the picture and wrote a note to his father on the back. I think the kid may have said his father's name, but he wrote it. That's about all he said. And the president comforted him, and the little boy just reached out very quickly and grabbed a hold of the president and just held on for life. And the president just held him. And, you know, the kid, there was no chance he was ever going to see his father alive. And all he wanted to do was hold on to the president and have some sense of comfort. And this went on for 2.5 hours. Kirby John Caldwell was a high flyer on Wall Street who one day woke up and said, is this what life is supposed to be about? And went back to Houston, Texas, and started a church in an abandoned shopping center. And he's a really remarkable guy. And I really felt guilty when I walked out of there thinking to myself, I have an obligation to throw myself back in there. And a few minutes later, he came out weeping. And for some reason or other, it was comforting. If this extraordinary person couldn't take it, I didn't need to feel guilty about not being able to take it. But the president did. For we arrived into Javits Center at 4:45 p.m. He walked in, and there was a shift change, and he posed for pictures. It couldn't have been more than 20, 30 minutes. Maybe call it a half an hour, call it 5:15. We left there at 7:58, 1 hour and 40 minutes after the schedule said we were supposed to leave there. And the entire time in between, he was comforting those families.
Before I end the evening with a quote from President Bush, I'd like to ask those in our audience who served in the White House during 9/11 to stand up and be recognized, please. President Bush wrote in his memoir, Decision Points of 9/11, September 11th redefined sacrifice. It redefined duty, and it redefined my job. The story of that week is the key to understanding my presidency. For as long as I held office, I could never forget what happened in America that day. I would pour my heart and soul into protecting the country. I want to thank our panelists for sharing their stories of that eventful day. I want to thank those who just stood up and our panelists for all they did to help to keep our country secure during the administration. Thanks so much for coming tonight, and thank you all.
Thank you.